City. Good morning, I'm Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's what you need to know. China hits Nvidia. Beijing rules that the chip giant violated anti-monopoly laws after a preliminary probe. That's as US-China talks extend into day 2 in Madrid. Trade, TikTok and defense on the agenda. And investors gear up for a big week of rate decisions with the Fed, BOE and the BOJ on deck. And it looks like we're starting Fed Week on a positive note, at least for the S&P and Russell 2000 futures, which are pointed higher. We were looking at positive Nasdaq 100 futures, but after that China decision came out, Nvidia turned lower pre-market, and that's dragging on the Nasdaq 100. Don't forget, we were setting up for a 9th day of gains for the Nasdaq 100. It was a week where we saw it up 1.9% last week, and the S&P was up 1.6% too. Let's look at yields, because Kamakshia Trivedi just telling us we're entering the zone of maximum risk for the US economy. Goldman Sachs expecting 3 rate cuts this year, though, and maybe a soft nod to one in October, but no more than that. Yields pretty much where we left them on Friday. Let's get to some individual stocks to watch now with Valerie Teitel. Valerie.
Good morning, Bonnie. I want to start with Hims & Hers. It's sinking further in pre-market, down nearly 3.5%. This is on the back of the FDA chief writing an article over the weekend, essentially using the Hims & Hers Super Bowl ad as an example of what not to do with pharma ads, saying it did not disclose the appropriate side effects, and is using this case to argue for more stringent regulations when it comes to pharma ads. And this comes just a few days after Trump's executive order on declaring that these pharma companies have to declare even more side effects in their ads. Let's move over to the tech space. More regulatory scrutiny here, but this time coming from China. China launched not just 1, but 2 probes into the chip sector over the weekend. One of them focused on anti-dumping measures when it comes to American-made IC chips. We're seeing Texas Instruments and Analog Devices both down nearly 2.5% on the back of this. This comes at a time when China is cracking down even more on U.S. tech companies. We also heard about NVIDIA, as you mentioned, that share also in the red, down over 2%, nearly 3% now in pre-market trade. This comes after a ruling from China that they have violated antitrust law when it comes to an acquisition they made a few years ago. But Bonnie, this is really China perhaps amping up the pressure on the U.S. as those trade negotiations continue in day 2 in Madrid.
Yes, the timing is very odd, right, Val? Thank you so much, Valerie Teitel there. Well, let's stay right with it. Bloomberg executive editor for Global Tech, Peter Elstrom, joins us now. So, Peter, this relates to the acquisition of Mellanox, as Valerie was saying. Can you explain what China has actually decided?
Yeah, this is a very good example of how these multinational corporations can get caught in the crossfire between Washington and Beijing. So NVIDIA made this acquisition of Mellanox a few years ago, originally announced in 2020, and then they got approval from Beijing to go ahead with the acquisition in 2021, as long as they didn't discriminate against Chinese companies in their business. Now, we know what happened after that. The Biden administration and the Trump administration set in bans where NVIDIA couldn't sell its chips, its highest end AI chips, to Chinese companies, to customers. So by definition, it's discriminating against them. And now Beijing is coming back and saying, hey, you promised that you weren't going to discriminate against these companies. Now you are violating those antitrust laws. So this is just a preliminary ruling. We don't know exactly where it's going to go from here. Of course, there are also trade negotiations going on at the same time, but it's an indication that NVIDIA is going to have some troubles here.
Yeah, and NVIDIA had disclosed that it might be liable for penalties depending on this decision. It was clearly looking forward to a time when there was a potentially negative decision for the company. But at the same time, what Mellanox does within the company is not a huge portion of what NVIDIA does, right?
That's right. And Jensen Huang has been pushing quite hard to be able to sell chips into China. He wants to be able to tap into that Chinese customer base. The United States and China are really the 2 leaders in AI at this point. They're investing the most in AI services in particular. So NVIDIA would like to be able to sell its entire range of products into China at the same time that it does in the United States. They've gotten somewhat of a hearing in Washington under Donald Trump's administration, where at first they wouldn't allow NVIDIA to sell this H20 chip, and now they can. So there is some movement on that front, but it's all tied into very complex negotiations between politicians on both sides here.
Peter, thank you so much. That is Peter Elstrom there. Let's over to Washington, D.C. now. Bloomberg's Kasia Kimishinska is back with us.